much. Now we'd like to call on the member of government.
Ladies and gentlemen, being a nationalist does not also mean you can't be a humanist. It does not also mean you can't have a religion. It just means that you buy into an idea that is bigger than yourself. And what Steph and I are going to do for you today is tell you why that idea of something bigger than yourself or something binding your polity together is incredibly useful on several levels. First of all, we're going to look at the good of the state and how it enables numerous goods to be bought for all people, whether or not they even want to buy fully into that identity or not. And second of all, at sort of civil buy-in you get in sort of procedures or politics that happens within those states. But a couple of things we want to get off the table, first of all, from opening up. Now, first of all, they tell you, look, in any case, we just don't think the state should be in a position to facilitate people's identity. And we say on Prop that unfortunately, in some ways, identities are always going to form. So the state is, in this instance, however, comparatively better when it pushes a nationalistic identity. And it is so because any other form of identity necessarily crowds out other identities which aren't contemporaries to that. So for instance, when we have a Christian state, that would crowd out other religions which don't fall within that. And crucially, people who don't buy into that religion would find no common ground whatsoever to be able to buy into that religion in the first place. Whereby with nationalism we say, by virtue of being within these borders, you are a member of this polity, and we do value you, and you have opportunities to participate. No, thank you. So we actually think it's the least harmful identity you can have on the comparative. Second of all, we say, well look, the problem is you have a birth lottery. And yes, we accept it is relatively arbitrary where you fall. We think that there are social goods which come when states push nationalistic projects, which means that even if it's a constructed idea, and indeed we agree that it is, that doesn't mean it's not socially useful, and we're going to tell you why it is in our speech. Thirdly, they say, look, this is a device that states use to do bad things. Now, unfortunately for them, they're woefully lacking on examples when they actually come to this. We're going to cover a couple of things. So first of all, we want to make very clear, we're not supporting ethno-nationalism. We're being very clear all the way down the top bench. We're supporting a positive form of civic nationalism, ladies and gentlemen, of a proudness in your state and in your community and your nation. And that doesn't have to be set in opposition to other states. We give you the example of Tanzania, ladies and gentlemen, where Julius Nyerere set up nationalism, which is about the grandeur of the Tanzanian state, rising from post-colonialism. Even though that could have been set in opposition to colonialist interests, it wasn't. It was set purely in positive terms in terms of what the Tanzanians can do for themselves. So we don't agree that it has to be set necessarily in opposition to anyone else. Moreover, they say, well, the scenes between wars between states. And we say this is overly simplistic, ladies and gentlemen. Any war has to be conducted on like a multitude of grounds in terms of strategic interests, the kinds of resources you can mobilise, like what the other state has comparative to you. The only example they can give you is World War I, which was not done on nationalism, ladies and gentlemen. It was about like an entangled strain of alliances. So this just doesn't actually stand for their side of the house in terms of creating more conflict. And like, we'd like them to give us some more examples. The only one we could possibly think of would be former Yugoslavia, but of course that was where you had weak state institutions which couldn't properly promote this, and again was ethnic nationalism, not the civic nationalism which we're giving you. So those don't stand. But why should you support nationalism then? Well, first of all, we talk to you about the good of the state. Now, recognise that everyone has multiple identities, but what those identities are about the ways in which we begin to assess values, our sense of belonging, beliefs, and the ways in which we interact with other people in our community, the ways in which we form, the ways in which we want to live, and the ways in which we understand other people. Crucially, these are always malleable, and they're always shaped by participants and other actors in relation to those participants as they live their lives. And therefore we can, and we do, we think we should, states should proactively define this form of identity nationalism to be a positive view of yourself and your community. Why is that? Well, it's because when you get that, you don't necessarily crowd out the other identities which you still hold, right? I might be an atheist or a white woman, but I can still, within Britain, say identify with a Muslim, Pakistani immigrant man who is also British. So what are those sorts of things? Those sorts of common bonds which enable you to view other citizens as similar to you, even when on the face of it they might be incredibly different. That has numerous payoffs, ladies and gentlemen, which you don't get the kind of leeway under their side of the house. But before I continue, Al,
do you honestly believe that nationalism can accommodate and represent every person within that nationalist project?
We think comparative to what, as I said in my rebuttal, comparative to any other form of identity? Absolutely. But moreover, we say, because you do build these positive nationalisms, that is the way in which most people can buy into it. Because moreover, we say is, well, let's get into my main points. First of all, because it stops people from being able to appeal to violence to subgroups, right? The point at which you have faith in a macro institution of your national identity, you don't feel the need to retreat into ethnic boundaries beneath that in order to wage violence with other groups, because you have a faith that the national institution is going to be protecting everyone, precisely because that is so well established at the top, ladies and gentlemen. Second of all, we said that enables states to undertake policies which might then help their states in the long run, and particularly when they have to have short-term sacrifice, they can appeal to a larger picture into the future. So we say, for instance, we look at Turkey, which is incredibly nationalistic, and the sacrifices it has to take in order to get EU ascension. Those kinds of economic restructuring programmes are a lot easier when you can say, look, we're trying to fulfil our nation's destiny in pushing forward the state's position within international politics. And that's something you don't get on their side of the house when you do just end up with parochial interests trading off of each other. And we think, furthermore, in the first instance, it enables policies that help most people, particularly when we look at most countries emerging out of colonialism. We look, for instance, Latin America, and the kinds of positive nationalisms we see in Venezuela, in Bolivia, which are tied to projects about helping everyone, because you tie everyone's interest to everyone within the polity, not parochial class interests, which means you're much more likely to get policies which are more equitable in terms of their economic redistribution to other people within the state. We think that's positive for enabling all citizens to access goods, whether or not they want to buy in to the nationalist project. So second of all then, looking at the civil buy-in, and we say precisely because you create this identity which is bigger than you, an indomitability of spirit, you enable people to accept trade-offs within states which they otherwise might not accept. So for instance, you can accept the democratic rules of the game, saying that I may disagree with you as a Republican or a Democrat, but I respect you because you are also an American, and we are tied to a common project of American greatness and exceptionalism, which means that, for instance, you respect the institutions of the state, the institutions of the presidency, even if you don't necessarily respect the views of the incumbent. And that means you get the kind of discourse which means that you can sustain democracy and exchange of ideas in the long run, which again, therefore protects even sub-national identities which they want to do, precisely because you have these greater degrees of freedom. By solidifying macro institutions at the top, ladies and gentlemen, you enable sub-national institutions to thrive. But even just having that national macro institution on its own is a source of pride for people. And we think that's something that's valuable, it's something which ties communities together, and which we're happy to support.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call on the member of the opposition.
Madam Speaker, in this debate, proposition celebrated the claim by Barack Obama that there wasn't a black America and a white America, just the United States of America. Opening opposition would rather he had more cosmopolitan rhetoric. At closing opposition, we just rather he didn't lie. Because we believe that when it comes to trying to get a job, or the likelihood that you're going to be frisked by police, or your capacity to join the political elite of your country, there is a white America and a black America. We believe that we can accept the challenge of opening identity if these different forms of identity are more important, are more useful, are more valuable. That's the extension we're going to bring to you in this debate. First of all, I'm going to talk about why these other identities are better. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why they're harmed, even if the state is an ethno-nationalist. And finally, about the use of history and tradition in politics, before moving on to some other rebuttal that doesn't fit within my extension. First of all, why are other identities better? Because all forms of identities are often mobilised by political elites. Opposition concedes that in this debate. But very few are wholly contrived by political elites. We think this is what sets nationalism apart. Because when a religious leader stands before you and says this is what it means to be a Christian, your capacity to disagree is because you can reference to a text. It is substantiated by something outside the words of that speaker. The presentation of nationalism from opening government is specifically a rhetorical construct of the state to persuade you to buy into that state project. Insofar as that's true, you can't necessarily dissent from that view. So the way in which the American government was able to say what it means to be American is to hate terrorists Their capacity, according to the logic of proposition, the state and nationalism are inherently fused, is that because the state is doing that action, it's incredibly difficult to dissent outside that state, to attack that, without being undermined by the extent to which you yourself remain an American in that context. We think it's different, right? Because it's fundamentally fused with state power. Because the elites who are meant to be electing are controlling the production of this form of identity. But also, one of the best things about these identities in comparison to nationalism is they make no claim to unify. They make no claim to minimise your difference. Instead, they celebrate it. What we think, unfortunately, about nationalism is while its object is often to unify people, in fact, it just removes people's capacity to be different. And that damages them even more, makes them more isolated than just being different could be. Because when the American state becomes a Christian state, that marginalises people far more than just being Christian and Muslim. Because the whole project of nationalism was meant to be unified. So there's something deficient about you, because you can't ascribe to it, because it isn't linked to you. We think that's very damaging. Okay.
In a state that is majority Christian, how do you ever make the majority care about the minority if you're celebrating just them being Christian?
We don't think the state should celebrate people being Christian. That was not the burden of the op in this debate, right? What we suggested at this particular point is that the state doesn't construct an identity people. That was the first thing you heard from the Prime Minister, right, in his conception of what a state was. What we believe is when you grant nationalist projects, you allow them the right to narrate a national story to their people, and that's particularly damaging. Why? Because Prop Bench only wanted to talk about nationalism where it worked. They're like, not the kind of nationalism that leads to civil strife. Like, not the kind of nationalism in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. They said it didn't cause apartheid. Madam Speaker, it caused apartheid. We believe in this debate. You can't just say you want to work with nationalism. We will take them at their incredibly low burden and only talk about universalising nationalism. Only talk about nationalism that don't attempt to just say we're a Christian country. Why are they still damaging? Because politicians don't have an interest, nor do they have the capacity to actually create a universalising nationalism. We look at American history, we look at American identity over time, and we see that there's a particular picture being presented, and a picture that doesn't speak universally, but purports to do just that. How does it do this? We believe that the American dream says that America is capitalist. That's damaging if you're American and a socialist. We believe that the white picket fence suburban narrative of Americana identity says that it's wrong if you're gay. We think it says it's wrong if you don't subscribe to that particular way of life. And all the while, it's saying that at that particular point you need to connect to that identity. Why is this damaging? Because opening government said two things about nationalism. They're like, it's great because you can opt in and out. And then the other time they talked about nationalism, they said the power and function of nationalism is when you use nationalism because you believe that your neighbours believe in it, because you believe your children believe in it, because you believe your entire community, your entire state believes in it. Insofar as that's true, you have a limited capacity to opt out under that particular time. I think that's damaging. As Emmett said, everyone has to value this central national future, or most people do. We think that's damaging because that national image can't describe minorities if it's going to appeal to the majority, which is the political incentive around the construction of nationhood. What are the consequences of this that are so damaging? We need to look no further than the benefits of nationalism espoused by the proposition bench, both opening and closing half. Nationalism measures your capacity to sacrifice. It measures your capacity to be included, your willingness to respect the law. We believe that it's damaging to these communities when they're excluded from those nationalist projects. It's no accident that there's more crime in black communities. It's not just caused by poverty. We believe it's also caused by the idea that the state doesn't hold their interests at heart. We think it foments oppression while helping people forget about it. We think it's damaging when Barack Obama stands up as a black American and implies that we are just one America. Obviously, that's his political incentive to do that. He doesn't want to frighten the white people. But what we believe in this debate is that what he does is a disservice to a community that is still oppressed by white people, by pretending that they're all part of a national project that assists some people more than others. That fiction is damaging because the other identities, which are often essential to people, unlike nationalism, like your race, something you can't change, is now ultimately something that is being used to be silenced and ignored from that political tradition. We think that is incredibly damaging. We also think it's damaging and patronising to say to citizens, as opening and closing government have done, that in order to have a motivation to be compassionate, one necessarily has to have that dressed up in the ideological construct of nationalism. Why can't I just care about my neighbours, my communities, my families in the first place? They are sufficient to motivate me to pay tax, to go to war, to respect the law. Hell, I just want some of my tax money back. I just want a stable society. I just want other people to respect the law. That's a sufficient motivation. And as far as we don't require it in order to do those particular things, we think it's damaging to tell people a lie that ultimately we are all one country, when there are differences that should be and are more valuable to other people we are so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, and now I'd like to call on the government whip to close out their bench.
Ladies and gentlemen, no nation is perfect, but the existence of nations is still better than their absence. What opposition bench never tells you is the ways in which the other divisive identities that continue to exist in our society somehow disappear if the nation itself disappears. And we do think it's their burden to be able to do that, because otherwise all of the references they're giving about the ways in which the United States has failed Black America, about the ways in which particular nations end up persecuting their people, are all the more exaggerated for the absence of the moderating force of the state. We bring you 3 points from closing a proposition and to sort of crystallize this debate. The first of which is about the ways in which identity is formed. The second is about the ways in which nationalism is superior to other identities. And the third is the ways in which institutions supported by nationalism ultimately transcend the kind of petty politics that would otherwise exist within our countries to a far higher level than it currently does. So, on the first point about identity formation, what they tell you on side opposition is that nationalism is contrived by political elites. But what we tell you on side proposition, and what Jen tells you in particular, is that nationalism is the only identity that you subscribe to that you can have complete creative possibility over. What we tell you about nationalism, it is something that is a national project that you as an individual contribute to, that you as an individual have the opportunity to control, and that can be defined positively, rather than simply in opposition to the other ways in which people try and define you in society. What we tell you on side proposition is that the national project of Tanzania was not to say, look, here's a way in which we can radically define ourselves against the colonizers who made our lives such hell for the past several centuries. The project of Tanzania was to talk about the positive attributes of the Tanzanian people and the Tanzanian state. And what that ultimately created was an extremely peaceful Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, a peaceful Tanzania that transcended ethnic divisions, that transcended religious differences, and that didn't make war against other states because it took its project as being a positive rather than negative one. They don't tell you how any of the other identities that, mind you, do not cease to exist if you oppose the motion can do the same. The next thing they tell you is that everything else has external reference, right? So the reason it's okay for Christianity to be able to say this is what's Christian and what's not is because you can point to a book. But nationalism, on the other hand, is something that political elites just get to define arbitrarily. What we would say instead is that that also enables you as an individual to actively shape what you see as being relevant to your nationality. What we also think is that means there is more ultimately creative possibility that you get as a result of that. And finally, it means that you have a much higher opportunity for inclusiveness than you would under concepts like Christianity or under concepts like class. So what they tell you finally is that you can't opt out, right? That there is no way to escape the totalizing power of nationalism. What we tell you is, well, A, you can move, right? Like, if you dislike your nation, you can probably pick a new one. I currently live in England, well, admittedly not because I dislike the US, but I could try and stay if I wanted. The next thing that we want to tell you, though, is that you can still change the understanding of what it means to be a part of that nation. And we argue that you do indeed see those changes happen over time. They want to talk about the ways in which the United States ends up being racially divided or divided by class. But note that the United States as an entity views itself far differently than it did at the founding of our Constitution, when the United States of America was apparently only elite, propertied, rich men, which we think is ultimately a shift that was produced by the people of the United States in favor of the concept of the state. And we think that's critical. So why do we think nationalism is superior to other identities? Well, first off, we get this challenge that, nationalism is something that enables you to limit other people's participation. What we tell you is that we aren't in favor of nationalism that defines on other identity characteristics, because then we would be proposing that we were in favor of those other identity characteristics. That's not the debate. So we aren't saying that this House supports ethnicity, or this House supports religion. We're saying this House supports nationalism, which we see as being a format of civic nationalism, as Jen points out to you in her speech, talking about the ways in which we see each other as members of a shared community, members who share a collective identity, and who strive towards a political project that ultimately ends up reinforcing those commonalities, rather than reinforcing our differences. But I'll take closing.
You said that in the former states of Yugoslavia there was lots of damaging in the nationalism. That was because preceding that was a nationalising state project that got people to try and forget their differences that actually realistically existed. Don't you believe that some forms of totalising state nationalism actually obscure political difference and therefore create violence?
No, Daniel. Preceding that was a state collapse, followed by an extraordinarily weak state that just did a really crappy job of convincing people that they did in fact have things in common. Right. So, presumably if you fail at nationalism, you fail at getting our benefits. We will concede that. But what we do think is that if you succeed in nationalism, you get our benefits. We think the logic's relatively simple. And in the case of the former Yugoslavia, when they then went on to talk about the ways in which ethno-nationalism ought to be supported, that again gets into things we aren't talking about within the motion, which again, we aren't supporting. So, no thanks. So, the next thing that they tell you is that nationalism causes strife, and that we're only talking about sort of hippy-dippy, kumbaya versions of nationalism, and maybe we should actually take on something real. What we tell you is we are taking on something real. That there are plenty of ways in which you could have opted this case that would have taken on the questions about common and collective identity, but you didn't, and that's not our fault. What we also tell you is that the sort of questions that you have about, creating false identities, that is to say the ways in which the United States whitewashes things, quote-unquote, with the picket fence, are A, up for contestation, which is something that you only get under identities that can be repeatedly constructed and shaped by their participants. And secondly, what we tell you is that ultimately you have institutions that transcend all of these other parochial interests, which will be the point that I close on. So what Jen tells you is that there are institutions as a result of the state, and as a result of having a strong state, a state that people believe in, that everyone sees as their institutions, as opposed to a church that you don't belong to, as opposed to a class that you don't care about. The institutions of the state and the common project therein is one in which you recognize that there are political trade-offs that you might have to make, but those trade-offs are made because you'll get yours the next time around, as well as the fact that you presume that the people who are making those decisions are making them in good faith. And they make them in good faith because you perceive yourselves as a part of the same entity and sharing beliefs and ideologies rather than finding yourselves in conflict with each other consistently. We think ultimately the nation-state creates a grounds upon which you have a capacity to identify with other people, and it has the capacity to identify beyond the ways in which we otherwise would be an utterly divided society. We propose.
The whole government bench, and now I'd like to call on the opposition whip.
Madam Speaker, curiously in response to the POI that Swain just asked Steph, she said no. The reason why nationalism failed in Yugoslavia was the absence of a state to prop it up. Yet, in response to our extension, her only response was no, the state does not define nationalism. Individuals can take whatever they want from nationalism. It doesn't actually crowd out an individual's interpretation of those identities. We don't think those two statements could coexist, Steph, and we think that it was a problem that your rebuttal to our extension was mutually contradictory with other things that you said in our speech. I'm going to ask two questions in this whip speech. Firstly, to what extent is nationalism unifying? And secondly, given that we don't think that it can be very unifying, what does it do to the other identities that are left behind in this unifying narrative? So firstly, on the idea of the extent to which nationalism is actually unifying. We think that the government bench was quite confused, as my introduction suggested, as to what extent this nationalism would actually unify the societies. And that's precisely why our extension that spoke to how it could never realistically unify societies was a very important contribution in this debate. So what did Monash tell you on this issue? Kieran told you that nationalism is a useful unifying framework, but it is different from other identities because it is easier to opt out of it. Amit told you can just opt out of nationalism, but in order to engage in the American state, you have to engage in the nationalist concept of the America that is defined by nationalism. That was the confusion that the opening government had, because it was hard to say both that it was important and pervasive, but also that it was vague, could be interpreted by individuals, or was easily avoidable. Why was that a problem? Firstly, because we don't think it is easy to opt out of what is allegedly a unifying narrative, because we think, for instance, that Amit was marginalised at lunch today when he didn't care that Australia was 3 for 27. But moreover, we think that their responses to our analysis about why it was hard to dissent from that unifying narrative was an absolute cop-out on the basis that they conceded that nationalism, if it is effective, as they, like, the only forms of nationalism that they allegedly want to support are the effective ones, is going to be unifying. So when we said that you couldn't dissent from a unifying narrative because you would be portrayed as a betrayer of that state, as a traitor to that state, we thought that was problematic because that reduced people's ability to criticise that. And then Amit brought you this analysis about how you would only support the law, you would only engage in that state if you were nationalist. That's a problem if you say that someone who dissents from nationalism doesn't support the law. They're likely to break the law, and that was the analysis that we brought you about the reasons as to why crime rates in Black America are higher, because they don't necessarily engage in that unifying narrative in America. We didn't think that Amit ever actually gave you a response as to why you couldn't dissent to that, because we didn't think you were able to, and he couldn't overcome that analysis. On the second idea of this debate, which was the clash largely of the closing half about other identities, what these guys wanted to tell you at closing government is that actually nationalism doesn't crowd out other identities. We told you that it certainly did. It marginalised those other identities, and marginalising those things in favour of other unifying characteristics was not effective, it was not constructive, or it was not even realistic in this debate. The example that they brought you was on the history of Tanzania. Swain and I are going to be pretty open about this. We don't really understand the history of Tanzania as much as we assume Oxford did. We got rid of our fact file halfway through this tournament. But the point being is that we don't think that even the nationalist project of Tanzania was ever going to be able to accommodate all of the different people within that nationalist project. Indeed, the number of POIs that we asked the government bench on whether or not they thought that nationalism could accommodate all of those people suggested that they didn't even think that. All of their responses to our POIs was, no, it cannot accommodate everyone. That's why it is okay to opt out of a nationalist project. So it was important that our extension spoke to the unrealistic aim of nationalism to actually unify people. I'll take a minute now.
Nationalism is an ongoing belief in the value of the state, but the content of that nationalism and the content of that state is up for contestation. Why is nationalism, as opposed to one particular type of nationalism, bad?
I don't think that it is up for contestation for the reasons that I just brought you, that we don't think it is easy to dissent from that nationalism. But moreover, if it is unifying, we think that you marginalise other forms of identity. For instance, the American dream of this is really the Australian dream, of having a 2-acre block, of having a house with a backyard, having a house with a picket fence. Firstly, that is inherently materialistic. It is inherently capitalist. It suggests that people who can't get there are less American. It is also heteronormative in the way that it suggests that a nuclear family is the best thing for Americans to aim for. We think that that marginalises other identities, and we don't think that got sufficient response from Oxford, because we think that nationalism exploits these other identities in defining a nation. Like, the type of good nationalism that they wanted was one that would not define the nation at all, because if there is no dream or nation to attach to, we don't think that you are ever going going to be able to remain silent on the ideas of what that nation wants, which is apparently what the government bench wanted in today's debate. We think that they were unable to prove to you that nationalism wouldn't marginalise those identities, because in order to get a persuasive image so that someone could attach themselves to of what a nation looked like, they inherently needed to appeal to the majority, which was also our analysis of how this was an image that was constructed by elites. It was constructed by the state, and they have a majoritarian interest to often marginalise those other images within that state, which is harmful when they have no ability to opt in to that national image. And as I said in my introduction, even Steph acknowledged that when she said that in order in Yugoslavia to have nationalism, they needed to have a state to define that nationalism. We think that that conceded our material about how nationalism is defined by elites and it's defined by the state. We think that in the end of this, that at the end of this issue, that what we proved to you is that other identities are fundamentally important. It is problematic in politics to just pretend like those identities don't exist. So what the closing government's extension told you was no, you could just define nationalism positively. You could define everyone's interests as being the same. Problematically, our extension told you that everyone's interests aren't the same. In a national project, it is not okay to pretend like everyone's interests are the same. That means that people are inherently sidelined, because people who are more marginalised, people who are less enfranchised, have a problem accessing that nation. When all of the government bench told you that in order to engage in the nation, you have to opt into that nationalist project. In order to care about the nation, in order to affiliate with that nation, you have to also buy into that nationalist project. We think that people who choose not to are marginalised. That is harmful in this debate, when nationalism inherently cannot realistically cope for everyone, accommodate everyone in that debate. We told you specifically that we think that they marginalise women, they marginalise gays, we think that they marginalise people who can't afford to aspire to that national image. Because we think it is unrealistic for nationalism to accommodate everyone, and when it doesn't, it marginalises those it doesn't accommodate, we're very, very proud to oppose.